The real story this time will tell about a rich man named Mr. Getty. Not only rich in his country, guys, but Mr. Getty is known as the richest figure in the world. One day Paul's grandson Mr. Getty was kidnapped by a group of mafia, making his mother even have to fight hard to save him from the kidnappers' hands. One that is unfortunate. Mr. Getty doesn't want to give a penny for the ransom that the kidnapper asked for. How come? Yes, there is such a stingy grandfather to his plea. This is the story of the stingy richest billionaire Mr. Getty.
Roma 1973 began when a boy named Paul was walking enjoying the beauty of the night. Suddenly the car stopped in front of him and he was immediately pulled by a group of unknown people, and after that Paul was taken to a place far enough away that he to the Cabria. It's the southern part of Italy.
Then one of the kidnappers known as Cinquanta called Paul's mother and asked for a ransom of $17 million. Apparently the money was very big for him, and he also said that he could not pay the ransom, and because this thief knew that Paul had a billionaire grandfather, he finally ordered to ask his grandfather. 9 years before the kidnapping, Paul's family lived in an ordinary house and far from luxury. One day, because Paul's father went bankrupt, he was forced to ask his father for a job. Getty, this is a wealthy businessman who owns hundreds of oil companies in various parts of the world. That Getty is a person whose calculations can be seen when he gave a statue to Paul. He explained that the statue he sold could cost up to $2 million in Rome, when in fact he bought it for $11 from the black market and $11 after he bargained for 1 hour from the price of $19. You can imagine that a billionaire to buy a statue for $19 is still bidding, guys. Though he knows the advantage of the statue can thousands of folds, and not only that, he is even willing to wash his underwear and not necessarily loses the laundry service that is only $10, because he thinks if it can be done alone, why to pay people? There is nothing wrong with the principle that, or in fact he can succeed in the richest businessman and develop its business in various parts of the parent world. Paul initially rejected the statue of the statue, however. According to Getty, it is not because how they are his family. In the end of the meeting, Getty also raised pale Paul as the deputy president of the executive of the oil, where it will be responsible for oil operations throughout Europe. But unfortunately, after all that went on for several years, even his father fell asleep and drowned in drunken drugs until he held a party with the women, and right in the year 71, Paul's mother, who could no longer stand her broken family situation, finally filed for divorce from her husband. In a meeting, he also made an agreement that he would not take any property, even alimony, for Paul as long as that afternoon he could take Paul away and get full custody. In the following days, Paul was now living simply with his mother and arrived in year 73, where Paul was kidnapped. The next day after the kidnapping, an assistant revealed the incident to Getty and said that Paul's mother and the police wanted to talk to him but didn't seem to care. Getty instead said if he was busy and couldn't be bothered, even though Getty really loved Paul and hoped he could continue the business later. But you guys don't forget, Getty is a person who never violates his principles, especially after Paul's mother made an agreement after the divorce at that time. The current situation is very urgent and there is no other choice but to ask for help from Getty Gale, as his mother Paul also keeps trying to contact Getty and hopes he can melt, because this involves the life of his grandson. But this is cancelled when he sees an interview on TV that Getty is there, the expression that he will not take any steps against the kidnapping of his grandson. In fact, he will not even pay $17 million as a ransom. He also reasoned that now he has 14 grandchildren and if he only pays money as a ransom once, the kidnapper will stole his 4 grandchildren and asked him to come back to make it up, realized what his ex-in-law had said, then decided to come directly to Getty's house alone, and because he didn't want to meet and argue that wasn't clear, Getty finally ordered the cast to accompany Gale to go back to Rome. A former CIA spy now worked as a negotiator for all of Getty's businesses. When they arrived in Rome, they were both immediately greeted with many questions from journalists. Lucky that at that time there was one police detective and they were immediately taken to the office to be shown with a bunch of letters that had been sent by the kidnapper. Apparently the news of the abduction of the grandson of the richest man in the world became an opportunity for other bad people, so that they too from various countries tried to send letters to Gale claiming they were the kidnappers. From the police also revealed that he was more suspicious of the original abductors were communists in Rome, and seeing from the many who took advantage of this situation, he suggested that they move to a hotel and they would provide protection. Meanwhile at the Cabiria, Chiquita asked Paul to return to writing a letter to his mother, and if there was no reply then he would not hesitate to send Paul's finger cut to him. On the sidelines they began to get close and talk to each other. Even Cinquanta was surprised by his rich grandfather had not yet given a ransom, and when he was about to give food because he was too busy talking, Chiquita forgot to wear a face covering so that Paul could recognize him. Pity, and he made a pact that he wouldn't report the incident as long as Paul didn't act silly or make it difficult for him. One day the cast found that his car had been marked by the communists. When he was about to move his car, suddenly a car approached him and asked him to come and ask him after he arrived. It turned out that the truth was revealed. Those who were there were Paul's own friends and they had previously been there. They make a deal to fabricate his own kidnapping and take some money from his grandfather, but they reveal that before the plan started Paul suddenly disappeared, so they suspect that Paul was planning his fake kidnapping with someone else. When it was revealed to Getty, the old man looked very disappointed and revealed that he really hoped that Paul could inherit all his knowledge in business, not only as a connoisseur of wealth. And at the end of the meeting Getty ordered the cast to go to Rome and wait for Paul to return home. In the Cabiria, one of the kidnappers was seen taking Paul to urinate while lighting a cigarette. He forgot to close his face again and Paul had to recognize one of the kidnappers. Afraid of being caught by the leader, he and someone who had just arrived panicked and immediately raised his gun to kill Paul. And shots were fired until it was heard by Cinquanta. And a few days later the cast got news that the police found a corpse that had been burned and thrown into the sea. The police suspected that it was Paul because a fisherman saw that this body was dumped from the car that had been used to kidnap Paul. But when Gale and cast arrived to check, it didn't take long for Gale as a mother to realize that it wasn't Paul. After really being identified, the police finally found out who was the group that kidnapped Paul, and when the raid was over, too bad Paul wasn't there until they finally also learns from one of the dying kidnappers that Paul has been sold. It turns out that Cinquanta plans to sell Paul to one of the mafia as well as the owner of a fake bag factory. At first, Cinquanta did not get paid a penny. The information he got, he also suggested that for now Getty must be willing to pay a copy for Paul because he believes the people who bought Paul are not ordinary people who they only think about profit or loss. Unfortunately, Getty still doesn't believe it and says there is no money to spare for the real thing, and the most annoying thing is when the rest of the family is busy with the kidnapping case of Getty's grandson. Instead, the painting transaction costs $1.5 million. After a few months Paul lived in captivity. His current condition looks insane. Cinquanta even had to encourage Paul to eat the food he was given, and when the guards were partying, Paul took the opportunity to start a fire and break down the back door. Cinquanta actually realized and saw Paul ran, but he purposely let it go until when Paul was far enough away. Then he informed that there was a fire. Paul felt his escape had gone far, then tried to intercept the car, and luckily he met the police and was immediately taken to the police station in the area. Did not want to wait long. He also immediately called his mother and asked to be picked up, but when Gail asked where the police station where Paul was, suddenly all of a sudden the next day Gail was reminded of a statue worth $1.2 million that Getty had given to his son, so without waiting long he went and intended to sell it to the auction place. He was surprised that it was an accessory statue for Gail. Tourists who didn't believe it and then left to prove it to a museum, and of course the statue is only priced at $15. It of course made him very frustrated and did not expect his father-in-law to cheat like that. On the other hand, in a state of unconsciousness, the kidnappers then cut off Paul's ear very viciously to be sent as a warning to a news agency. The news agency also plans to publish a photo of Paul's ear in the newspaper, and as compensation they will pay $50,000. Gail, who initially objected, then agreed and demanded payment in the form of a copy of 1,000 copies of the newspaper to be sent directly to the Getty's house. Apparently it managed to attract Getty's attention, and in a meeting he also revealed that he would pay a ransom for Paul, but the ransom for Paul was as a loan for his son, and as payment Gail had to give up custody of Paul to his father. Seeing the conditions and circumstances of his father, Paul, who looks confused, of course, Gail doesn't accept it, but this is the only way to save his son. Turns out the problem didn't end there, but the different tax rules from the country made the money that could be accepted at that time was only $1 million. Of course Gail became very confused. Moreover, Cinquanta asked for a ransom of $4 million and it was completely stuck. He tried very pitifully, so even suggested that Gail quickly pay for it because otherwise he couldn't do anything if the mafia there did something even more cruel. In confusion, Gail finally got the idea to announce that he now has everything. The ransom amounted to $4 million at his house. Getty, who witnessed this, was immediately surprised and again called the cast to face him. Getty immediately questioned where this Gail could get the ransom, and if the cast didn't tell Getty, he threatened to fire the cast who heard Getty arbitrarily. Finally can't talk, he muffled himself in his annoyance. He also said that in fact everything that Getty had so far was thanks to him, starting from the security system of the guards including other things. He was the one who had designed and arranged it, and before leaving he also said that Getty could have all the money he needed. Exist in this world, but it will mean nothing if it just continues like that. And when they arrived in Rome, the cast got news that Getty sent the full amount as a ransom fee of $3.3 million without waiting long. After the money was collected, the exchange plan immediately started. Cinquanta immediately suggested that Gail go south and leave the money in the middle forest, and then he was told to go to the gas station at the end of the road to wait for further instructions. While the kidnappers were counting the ransom money, Cinquanta himself was seen with his friends delivering thol to a place. He also advised Paul to immediately run and get out of Italy, and after the ransom was calculated, they immediately called Gail and told her to go to Paul at the construction site. Not far from there, but when we arrived Paul was not there because it turned out that after being dropped off Paul had run to get away from there. When the mafia leader was about to leave with all his money, that's when he heard a report from his subordinates that the police had surrounded him. Of course, he was very angry and ordered his men to immediately kill Paul while Paul himself was constantly running through the deserted city. Now almost caught. Lucky Cinquanta was there and saved him, and after that the cast came and he immediately recognized that it was Cinquanta. There Cinquanta again suggested that the cast go and take Paul out of Italy. And meanwhile at home Getty suddenly woke up from his sleep and he looked very restless. In his fear he was seen running to call his aid, but unfortunately the mansion was now empty, there was no one else there. Still living in despair, Getty finally took the last painting he bought, and not long after that the richest old man in the world died in his comfortable chair. The next day Gale was called to be Getty's successor until his heirs, his children, had grown up and were ready to run it. With that inheritance they finally created a Getty Museum in Los Angeles and donated some of their wealth to charity. Never expect that wealth is everything, that is able to fulfill every wish and hope, by never being complacent, let alone assuming that life is an eternal timeline and will run forever and ever. Today we are at the top and tomorrow who knows, we are even at the bottom and vice versa. Work hard and keep achieving everything you dream of. May success and goodness always be with you. Thank you for watching this video guys, and see you again in the next world movie video.